most of you know, Literatures of Exile is a research collective, lecture series, and digital archive that's focused on contemporary literature and scholarship that has been shaped by exile, transnational migrations, and human rights abuses. And this year's theme is the politics of translation. It's co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters and the Franco Family Institute for Liberal Arts and the Public Good. And we have support from many other institutes across campus, so we're very grateful to them as well. And thank you to the Brookline Booksmith Transnational Literature Series for co-sponsoring our event via Zoom and for all our guests who are joining us online. So I'll read brief bios and then launch into like a deeper intro. Karan Mahajan grew up in New Delhi and moved to the US for college. His first novel, Family Planning, was a finalist for the International Dylan Thomas Prize. It was published in 9 countries. His second novel, The Association of Small Bombs, was a finalist for the National Book Awards and named one of the 10 best books of 2016 by the New York Times. In 2017, he was named one of Granta's best young American novelists. And in 2019, he received the Janet Hayen Ballard Writers Prize, given annually to a young writer of proven excellence in prose. Karan's writing has appeared widely in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The New York Review of Books, The New Republic, and other venues. A former fellow at the Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars, which is the New York Public Library. He's an associate professor in literary arts at Brown University. Thank you for being here. Taseer is author of the memoir Stranger to History, A Son's Journey Through Islamic Lands, and the acclaimed novels The Way Things Were, a finalist for the 2016 John Mikulski Prize. The Temple Goers, shortlisted for the Costa First Novel Award and Noon, and the memoir and travelogue Le Twice Born. He's also the translator of a volume of Sadat Hassan Manto's short stories from Urdu, Manto Selected Stories. His did I just
there was a lot of thumbs ups in this corner over here.
We love Manto.
Good. Glad to hear it. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. He is a writer at large for T, the New York Times style magazine, where he writes these just incredibly beautiful journey narratives, travelogues that are collected in the book we're going to be talking about tonight, A Return to Self. So I highly recommend you follow him and his work that he publishes regularly there. He was born in England and raised in New Delhi, educated in the US, and previously a journalist in the UK, and now lives in New York. And also want to plug Karan Mahajan has a book coming out in March 2026, The Complex.
Which the font is such that it looks like it's the complex Karan Mahajan, but it's not. It's just called The Complex. But,
I think it can be close.
yeah.
But yeah, pre-orders go a long way. So pre-order away. Our series is now in its 6th and final year. And today's event, On the Demands of Belonging with Aatish and Karan, is one I've actually personally been anticipating for a long time. I'm going to do something I hardly ever do, which is share something personal. And it is probably going to seem irrelevant and preposterous, but I promise to circle back. When I was 5 years old, my mother, who had never left her children for more than an hour, announced that she had to go to India. She spent a month in silent meditation at the Sai Baba ashram in Andhra Pradesh. When she returned, she filed for divorce, and we moved first to California and then Iran. Then a few years later, under the pressures of a vigilante state, we moved again, this time to a community of Sai Baba followers in Reno, Nevada. I was utterly bewildered. I had to deal with displacement and forced meditation. And at one point, I actually had a vision of Sai Baba, and I went around telling everybody that I'd seen him. So naturally, when I turned 20, I too left for India. I had $6 a day and got by working on farms. My goal was to calm the many irreconcilable cultural currents that run through me. So Iranian, British, Spanish, American. But on a farm in Tamil Nadu, I met another female solo traveler, and our friendship completely derailed my mission. We laughed so much together. That constant monumental laughter loosened something in me, and I promise we were not on drugs. We'd both gone to India to find out what we were made of, and instead found ourselves laughing until we were crying and pissing ourselves, is, I believe, an enormous spiritual lesson. That the reach for authenticity is a cosmic joke. Be convinced that you can attain it, and you will laugh and weep like a clown. This unresolvable question of authenticity and belonging in the context of exile is the axis around which Mahajan and Taseer's work turns. One of the most compelling dimensions of Karan's masterfully structured novel, The Association of Small Bombs, is the constantly evolving image of the bomb that explodes at a market in Delhi in the opening chapter. The bomb becomes its own character in the novel, a gravitational force pulling every narrative thread into its blast radius. Hovering beneath the story is the unfinished detonation of Partition, the violent attempt to carve a multilingual, multi-ethnic civilizational expanse into two nation-states. Karan's novel is kaleidoscopic. It moves between the intersecting perspectives of the parents whose two sons die in the blast, the parents of their deceased son's friend who survives the blast, the Kashmiri bomb makers whose bodies are mutilated by political torture and bombs that malfunction. The bomb that explodes in the opening chapter quite literally begins to wrap itself around the warped lives of the characters, especially that of the grieving father. Karan writes, since the day of the blasts, he'd been consumed by what-ifs. Every way he turned, his past was detonated, revealing tunnels and alternative routes under the packed, settled earth of the present. For every decision, there were a million others he could have made. For every India, a Pakistan of possibilities. The history of partition thrums beneath the sentences, gathering speed and gravity as the novel extends from India to the United States during and after 9/11 and back again. Taseer's A Return to Self, Excursions in Exile, is a personal archive of the costs of partition politics. It is Taseer's response to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's revocation of his overseas citizenship, announced, I believe, on Twitter, after publication of his incisive profile of Modi in Times Magazine, which is like an education in Indian history, political history. The justification was that Taseer had concealed that his estranged father, an assassinated politician, was Pakistani, even though Taseer has written a book about his father and their estranged relationship. Reeling from the shock of being denied re-entry into his own country, Taseer writes, my relationship to India was instinctive. It formed the understructure of my creative life, a kind of 0 point from which I measured my distance to all other places. I know from personal experience that this loss of one's geographic position in life is similar to a gymnast having the bends, of losing one's orientation in space. Only in the case of exile, the injury is existential and physical. In A Return to Self, Taseer travels across the sites of ancient civilizations, Al-Andalus, Iraq, Mongolia, Istanbul, places shaped by coexistence before being eroded by forced displacement and erasure. What he is asking is, how does coexistence actually work? What happens to our sensibilities and sense of dignity when histories of plurality are erased in the making of homogeneous nation states? What I most admire about their work is the way they both push the boundaries of philosophical thought on the subject of exile. They're asking, is exile where one withers, cut off from the source, or where the self blooms into existence, propelled by rage and longing? Can it be, once the pain has been sat with, a paradisiacal experience, a big spiritual squeeze that unweaves the self, liberating it from the metaphysical borders that the nation state inscribes onto our identities, a letting go of the heavy garb of authenticity? My understanding of India's immense civilization and the ongoing global politics of the war on terror is much richer because of their work, as is my understanding of how my exile might someday feel like a relief. I also got to look again at the lessons India taught me in my younger years, laughing painfully and joyously at myself and all my fellow travelers for going elsewhere to look for oneself only to encounter one's alterity, the very condition of being human and a writer. So please join me in welcoming the two of them. You can get out here. Do you want to read at the mic?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike
Easier.
Taseer here. Thank you for that amazing introduction. So kind. And also, I should say, like, so rare to have a reader who's able to get under the surface of what the two of us are doing. And like you talk about partition as one of the sources of the kind of grief and displacement in our work. And, you know, I've taught Azreen's work myself with Brown, where I teach. And so it's like really fun to be here with her and to hear her talk about our work too. I was going to read at first from the Association of Small Bombs, but I feel like it's not going to live up to how good her introduction was. So I'm gonna given that we're talking about exile,
Yeah.
I thought I'd read like a small section from my new novel, The Complex, which is very directly about exile. And it actually appeared first as a short story in The New Yorker, but it's part of a novel. I won't tell you much. I mean, it's just about a character named Bibha who has just gotten married, and the year is 1959. Bibha was recalling the tragedy of her first marriage. Married off to an Indian doctor in 1959, she had moved to London only to discover that her new husband, Ravi, already had a wife in the city. Ravi didn't wait long to tell her. It was the night that Vibha and he arrived in London, haggard from their 2-day honeymoon in Jaipur, where an overenthusiastic bearer woke them every morning at 6 with bed tea. Then, on a connecting flight from Cairo, they had dozed, their heads forming a tent against the propeller roar. And now, in Earl's Court, the street empty save for murmuring students and a chestnut seller with a scratchy voice, they stayed awake into the night. Ravi showed her around the sparse, drafty top floor flat and plugged in the 3-bar fire. Then he began speaking to her in a businesslike way, a tone she'd never detected before in his arsenal of charm. I suppose, dear, we might as well discuss the issue at hand, he said. Casually, he brought up the fact that he was already married to a woman in England, Margaret, a nurse. I can only be half a husband, he declared. I owe a responsibility to this woman. You see, when I was lonely and sad in this new country, she was of great assistance to me, and I'm like a father to her 2 children. Now, let me finish. You see, there was no circumstance in which I could inform my family in Amritsar about her. People there don't understand these distances, the new world you and I inhabit. Ravi was a tall man with aristocratically weather-beaten skin. He stooped more and more as he spoke, clutching the daggers of hair at the back of his neck, one eye twitching a little, the whites embroidered with rivulets of red, even as his voice remained deliberate. You must realize, Bibha, it was a very difficult circumstance to me. When a man is cast away from home, he needs an anchor to keep his ship in port. Bibha stood on her toes. Swaddled in several hand net pullovers, she reached up and touched his face. Ravi looked as if he were going to sneeze, but then relaxed. He grew sleepy like a boy. Drowsily in bed, he kept speaking, and she shushed him and stroked his hair. In the morning, he woke full of energy and said, I won't see her. I don't know why I told you. It's long over. It was a marriage of convenience. You know Count Leo Tolstoy? On the night he and his wife were married, he told her everything about his past. Everything. But what about the children? Vibha wondered. Then she extinguished the thought. 3 days passed. Nothing more was said of the subject, and because it had been spoken of so late in the night, it acquired the quality of a memory from transit experienced nowhere. Ravi once again became the gallant man who had patiently showed her how to make love on their wedding night while relatives giggled outside and parroted raucous sex sounds. This actually happens to a lot of people getting married in India. He laughed heartily now at her Indianisms and on Sunday took her by the hand into the streets to name the flowers growing in boxes on the windowsills, damp and fresh and pouring downward, their tendrils caught in the teeth of sooty brick. Then, windy and dry day, the pavements heaving up dead leaves and blowing grit in the eyes, Ravi came home from the hospital where he worked, looking tense and withdrawn. Would you like a shoulder massage, Maikya ji? She asked. She had been hoping good behavior could make the nightmarish conversation evaporate. You judge me, don't you? He snapped. You think I'm a coward. Why couldn't I simply tell them, isn't it? Well, you don't know my family. My father is a very traditional person. And if your dear Papaji had taken the time to investigate, if he didn't have 9 other children to marry off, he would have seen it instantly. Don't say anything about Papaji, she growled. She loved her father, was proud of his role in the freedom struggle, the fact that he had retired as a cabinet minister without portfolio in Nehru's first interim government. Ravi hadn't even heard her. My father brought a great deal of pressure to bear on me to get married, he said. My mother, frail in the best of times, perversely worried about his health and made it seem he might have died if I didn't go ahead with the proposal. So you see, one's hands were tied. And then I met you and I thought, this is a modern woman, educated, well spoken from a great family. She is likely to understand. Don't cry. She cried some more. She was thinking again about how disappointed her father would be. He had gently warned her against marrying a man who lived abroad, but she had been adamant. She was a great lover of family, of her boisterous brothers. No one had expected her to leave India. But the converse of this love of family was a need to discover herself. Ravi started skulking around the flat, his black shoes gleaming brilliantly. He wore a scuffed pair at the hospital, he told her, and changed out of them when he left. I knew it, he said. No one understands. That night, he drove off in his Morris to his other family. It was Vibha's first night in England alone. Ravi had left a 3-bar fire going in the kitchen and a pile of shillings on the table for the meter. Otherwise, she would have frozen. Sitting at the dinner table, she composed a letter in her cramped but polite, slanting cursive. The letter was deliberate in its form as Ravi was in his tone of voice. I've had a relapse of my bronchial infection in Jaipur, she wrote to her father. Ravi, being a doctor, she said, had suggested she go home immediately and get fresh air in South India before it became too damp and cold in London. Now, I'm going to skip ahead just a tiny bit so I don't go on too long, which is the letter is sent to her father. He writes a letter back, but writes it actually to Ravi. And Ravi gets it and is very angry. And they have a kind of confrontation where he's saying, what's up, what's wrong with you? Like I told you the secret. And Vibha, after that, decides she is going to try to run away from the flat and go to her relative's house. And so this is a scene where he's just left the house. Yet as soon as he left the flat with its rippled floors and grimy lace curtains and unpainted window shutters, a flat she occupied in fear for much of the week, too frightened even to go out and greet the milkman, she started to pack her suitcase. She was crying. With each object she put in, she understood that her life as she had known it was ending, that what she was doing now was even more irreversible than the vows of marriage. She was throwing herself across a line, the line of being a woman without a husband, a nobody unprotected. And just as Ravi had smiled at the vision of their contented future, she wept for her future self. She knew what the future held for her. It was exactly out of a desire for a future that she had pressed for a match with this doctor living abroad. She had thought of marriage as a way to move through space at a speed India would not allow. So how much she had looked forward to Big Ben, Stratford upon Avon, the Tower of London, the Peacock Throne, heather and gorse and marsh and moors, the chance to leave her teeming family behind for a while. And on top of that, there was Ravi's collective, reserved British charm and style, such an antidote to her uncouth siblings. Yes, it was an arranged match, but she had felt truly known, had felt that she was picking her for their life together because she was special, not just because she was the daughter of a famous man. And they had made each other laugh with a reference to Gandhi's obsession with bodily functions, and she had loved that boyish gap in his front teeth, had dreamed about it. But of course, it was this very charm that allowed Ravi to imagine he could maintain 2 wives, 2 selves. What he had seen in her was not her intelligence, she thought now, but her pliability. Why else would he have been so reckless with someone from a famous family when he could have found a nobody who might have been grateful for even half or a quarter or a fifth of an Indian doctor? But perhaps Weber thought this was another aspect of his greed and charm and inquisitiveness. Perhaps he had forgotten when he saw her that he had an English wife. He was a divided person. He really was 2 people. And sometimes when he was home with her in their hot water flat, Ravi would appreciate her cooking, would laugh and joke with her in Punjabi. He was a great mimic of distant relatives of her, people he knew he could mock without hurting her, the voices bursting through his grey reserve, the Punjabi that of an exile, reflected with villagey phrases that made her laugh. "What's so bloody funny?" he would say with an affectionate cocked eyebrow before launching, almost as a response, into the squawking Punjabi of a family friend. It was as if a switch were being thrown, the serious doting doctor and the crazed mimic. And it was the same at the midpoint of the week when, the night before heading to Margaret's, he was seized by a coldness, his body flung about by chills as he lay next to her. It was as if he were remembering Margaret and the kids and his awesome pileup of responsibilities, aspects of life he had forgotten with Vibha. Perhaps this is why he married me, Vibha thought, because in fact he wanted to start anew, to be young again. She was now very angry at Margaret. How dare she never show her face here? She and I have more in common than most women, and she knows I'm here, new here, whereas she has lived her entire life here, and she's probably spends the days with him at the hospital. Doesn't she owe me a visit? But Margaret remained an enigma, and it occurred to Vibha that Margaret could very well have directed Ravi into this shy marriage. Then Margaret might have even explained to him the type of Indian lady who'd be most accommodating. Vibha could see them having a measured conversation over flower-patterned teacups. "Well, you see, darling, there's nothing to be done, is there?" Margaret would have said. "Quite right," Ravi would have said, sipping his weak tea. And then Vibha thought, no, no, this is wrong. These images are false. How can I be sure Margaret even knew about my marriage before Ravi returned from India, handcuffed to me? And now Viva felt that she could guess why Ravi became so cold towards her during certain weeks. These must have been the weeks when Margaret was raging at him, belittling him for his cowardice, overturning the imaginary teacups in fury, asking how he could be so spineless. Didn't he live 5,000 miles from home? And given the distance and the fact that he had money, power, status, and the awesome validation of British citizenship, what could his supposedly traditional family in Amritsar have done to him? "You surely can't think your grand old father would stoop to suicide now, do you?" Margaret would have said. And suddenly Vibha was fully in Margaret's head, speaking her voice, feeling her curvy, white, pale body from the inside, the body sagging at the center, but with blue eyes burning at the world, a woman all the way around, not boyish and wiry like Vibha, a carrier of children. Yes, Vibha was inside this other woman and crying and packing, and she thought, "I'm losing my mind. I am doubled now, too. I now have the gift or the curse of being inside everyone like my husband does. And it is because I can't bear to be inside my own self. I'll be anyone but me. I'll even be my enemy, Margaret, because in fact, we are one." Stop there.
That was really wonderful. I've actually read this book very early, and it's even better now. I'm going to open with just the opening, A Return to Self, Istanbul. At 9:05 on the 10th of November, 2020, a hush fell over the leaden turbulence of the Bosphorus. All activity on the strait ceased. Coast Guard ships, ferries, kayaks, like the younger members of a tribe of large marine animals, drew close in a circle. Behind them, a Turkish destroyer kept vigil, the blue of its gunmetal merging with the strait's frigid waters. A red-bottomed freighter marked with the words Iraqi line hulked in the background. That cityscape of sea-blackened buildings, broad panes glazed silver in the daytime darkness, was no ordinary left bank, no mere farther shore. The silhouette of low domes and pencil-thin minarets piercing a nimbus of pale sky above was the continent of Asia. The wonder of looking at it, with my feet still planted on the shores of Europe, was not lost on me. I had been in Istanbul for less than 72 hours. The air grew heavy with anticipation, and then low and deep and melancholy as whale song came the first moan of a ship's horn. Everyone froze. The uniformed figure of an old sea captain snapped to salute. A stout woman in a long black coat with a blue headscarf drew her toddler near. Even the seagulls, whose cawing and mewling was so much part of the commotion of the Bosphorus, fell in line with this solemn tableau. The air was soon resounding with ship horns and sirens. The moment of remembrance stretched out. Its object? Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, founder of the Turkish Republic, stared out at me from the backs of two young Turks, where his youthful likeness was emblazoned on the red ground of the Turkish flag the pair wore as superhero capes around their necks. The father of the Turks, blue-eyed and visionary, with a touch of the derring-do of the old Omar Sharif about him, had died 82 years ago at exactly 9:05 in Dolmabahce Palace behind me, an overcooked 19th century confection of pilasters and sleeping columns. We stood on its manicured grounds, speckled with magnolia and spruce, remembering the fierce secularist who in the 1920s had fought off European incursions on all sides and founded a modern republic from the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire. I was engaged in a remembrance of my own. As 9:06 rolled around and people stirred again, I awoke to the fact that I had seen all this before. I had traveled not only through space, but through time, journeying to a place where a younger self was waiting for me. 15 years earlier, I had stood at the edge of this very same waterway, witnessing this very same scene. Practically all my adult life lay between the last time I had come to this city as an aspiring writer of 25, ready to travel through the Muslim world for a book I had yet to write, from Istanbul to Mecca and from Mecca to Lahore. And now, when a few weeks away from 40, I had returned to Istanbul. Why? Was it to look at what had become of the world I had traveled through in 2005? Was it to look again at what had become of me? What I knew walking back through the plain-lined boulevards draped with Turkish flags, Ataturk speeches blaring out of rows of freestanding speakers on the pavement, was what I felt: paralysis. You can go back many times to the same place, says a character in V.S. Naipaul's 1979 novel, A Bend in the River, and something strange happens if you go back often enough. You stop grieving for the past. You see that the past is something in your mind alone, that it doesn't exist in real life. You trample on the past, you crush it. In the beginning, it is like trampling on a garden. In the end, you are just walking on ground. Istanbul was not flat ground for me. It was still very much a garden, the perfectly preserved repository of the hopes, ambitions, and confusions of my 25-year-old self. That first morning, I was so nervous about this disturbing the overlay of memory that I entertained fantasies of not venturing out into the city at all. I imagined spending whole days in the sanitized security of my room at the Swiss hotel, where I had paid $45 extra per night for a view of the Bosporus, gazing out at the sunlit splendor of the most beautiful body of water in the world. I would live on room service, swim 50 lengths a day in the hotel's indoor pool, and return a week later to New York City with my memories of Istanbul intact. My anxiety was akin to what one feels after a big snow, when one fears nothing so much as the size of those first tracks on its surface, knowing that it would ensure the destruction of what until that moment had been pristine. The city I had returned to was bathed in rare November sunshine. The Bosporus, by way of the Dardanelles, connects the Black Sea with the Empyrean blue of the Aegean, and what the travel writer John Morris has called waters of Homeric myth and yearning, was in a bright, inviting mood. I used to think it was the geography of Istanbul that was special, that extraordinary location of old Byzantium, the Greek colony that would form the nucleus of the future city, peering out at the confluence of three waterways, the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara, the estuary that is the Golden Horn. Antiquity had regarded those who built their city on the eastern side of the strait, the poor inhabitants of Chalcedon, the town on the facing shore, as blind for failing to see the superiority of this site for Byzantium. Now, of course, it was all Istanbul, a seething megalopolis of 15 million, set over hills of dark furrowed pine. As far as I know, only three cities through history, Rome, Istanbul, and New York, have been referred to as the city. The word Istanbul itself is a contraction of the Greek phrase "isten polin," into the city. One imagines it as a superior reply to a question from someone in the outer boroughs: where are you going? I'm going into the city, of course.
Thank you both so much for those beautiful readings. So lovely to hear from your next book. Yeah, I think we should talk about family, but maybe not right away. So, since our talk is called The Demands of Belonging, I wanted to maybe touch on a broader question about what that word means to each of you and how your sense of belonging or unbelonging shifts depending on where you are geographically in the US or in India. And I know for you, that's obviously not a possibility anymore. But I guess I'm curious, like, what parts of yourself do you have to excise when you're in the US? Which parts of you do you have to make go dormant when you're in India? Simple question to start. Yeah.
I mean, I think that honestly, one views it with I view it with a sense of immense privilege in some ways because, you know, in the US, in my personal life, I suppose that one partitions oneself very carefully. You're one person at home. You're one person in a gathering like this. So there is the like for me at least, I start from such a humble place of an appreciation that one could be in a country that would feel like this, and we could have this conversation and things that are of immense emotional and intellectual importance to me can be part of a discussion that I can let all that out. That sort of humility. I think that Naipaul used to say this thing about, like England made a little room for me. And I still live with that sense of gratitude. And I know that there's a destructiveness in that gratitude because what I feel about India is the uncritical sense of belonging where you think this is yours and you have every right to criticize it up and down, left and right. And I suppose that really forms the distinction between what is your country and the place you've come to. It's in one of the things that happened with that feeling of not going back to India, of having to explain oneself or saying why one was Indian, was that it abolished that a priori sense of belonging, that sense that I will not come as a petitioner or a supplicant to tell you why I'm Indian. I'm Indian because I'm Indian. And I think that I at least feel that in one place, despite my exile, the critical faculty is alive with all its like powers to be like even scornful, even contemptuous, even, it's your right. But I don't feel that in relation to the United States, and probably very safe for me that I don't. But the last thing I wanted to say was this thing of Sebastian Hafner leaving Germany and him, he's like, I don't love Germany. I don't love Germany like I don't love myself. But he's like, your country plays a role that's different from a mistress. There's this, there's this, and I think that's kind of like probably the core of the difference for me.
That's
Mm,
really interesting.
mm. That's beautifully put. Yeah, I mean, it's something I've been thinking a lot about. I mean, in this particular novel, actually, one of the characters is this woman named Geeta, and this is a different character, follows her husband to the US and is, kind of bored, can't find an identity there for herself that's not just as a wife. But then she goes back to India to visit like 2 years later, and everyone's like, you've become so American, right? This is the classic. And I think there's something where she really bristles at that, which I certainly was something that I put in from myself, which is that I remember this deep feeling of it's not the problem of not belonging here that bothered me, because I knew I was an outsider here when I came, but it was the feeling that people back home created a distinction between inside and outside so quickly. And that Aatish and I talk about this. It's a big part of the Indian psyche, especially with the caste system and everything else, where like and there's a lot of post-colonial suspicion of someone who goes out. There used to be a kind of, in Hinduism, you were supposed to lose caste if you went across the seas. And I think there's a vestige of that as well. And so that feeling, which some of it was probably just a projection on my part, but some of it was just like people saying things like that, where I was like, no, I haven't changed. I've only been gone a year. Or like, why have you been saying this? And so that's one aspect of it, which is that creates this feeling of like trying to prove that you belong still, which is a bad feeling. Actually, you shouldn't have to prove. that. But the other side of it, which I think is interesting, is that here, the Indian part of me is maybe conveniently dormant, where like it's reserved for my books. Like I feel like I don't actually have that many friends I speak in Hindi with. Like Aatish is actually one of my rare friends who like is from Delhi, not far from where I live. We got to know each other only later, but like we actually like have a lot to talk about because we share the same concerns. And I'm a huge fan of Atish's work, which is how we first met. But here, so that part of me is dormant, and the part that hasn't successfully found a foothold here is like I don't feel a passionate engagement with the politics here, despite the fact that it's such a political time. I feel myself having a kind of sojourner's attitude, which is like, oh, this bad stuff is happening here. I should do something about it. But basically, like I'm passing through, which is just not true.
Right.
And it's weird that that psychology can last so long. Like I'm interested in the ways in which people hold on to states of mind, even when they have no use for them anymore.
Well, it's really interesting because it's kind of like the quote from Maypool that you read is the impossibility of return exists the moment you leave,
Right.
in a sense. But when you leave, you do think that you can return for a
Yeah.
long time. And then I've had that experience too, like not of returning to Iran, but a family from Iran coming here and then saying that, oh, you're so Americanized. And I find it's like one of the most painful things they
Right.
could say, right? Because it's a kind of like disowning
Mm-hmm.
of, and also a lack of understanding of like the pain of migration, right? And
Right.
for me, possibly a lack of understanding of their pain of remaining or being like inside the system. But but we somehow think that like we can return, it can be recovered and hold on to that forever. And just this, I don't know, I had another thought about it'll come back to me. Oh, the split self, like the being two people, which I think you capture so beautifully in that passage. It's like unresolvable. Like once
Mm-hmm.
it's done, there's
Mm-hmm.
these two parallel versions of you, like
Right.
side by side. And I don't know that there's anything that can like really be done about that.
And what's true, writ small for the individual, is true in many of these societies historically as well. They've all had experiences of rupture,
Mhm.
of irreconcilable rupture, which can't, and that feeling of like wanting to return, of wanting to be at status quo ante, where you were not seen by hostile eyes, where you were not changed by. So, people living in these places professing authenticity have also been denatured
Mhm.
by certain historical experiences.
Mm.
And so, like, what they're saying to you, you've become so Americanized, is something that they're experiencing too.
Right.
Right.
They're not whole in any way that they
Right.
imagine.
Right.
Yeah. No, I mean it's true. And like you can just think even deeper, right, about why. Well, I guess uh, like Modi's politics and the way
Yeah.
that he's sort of like narrowing in, right, and creating this like Hindu sort of vision of India, right, and basically trying to like control people's identities in the way that they like might or might not relate to their past. It's very similar to like the Islamic Republic too,
Mm-hmm.
of just like cutting off a huge part of our history and our personhood and just being like we now have to be this one thing. And part of it is a response to like colonial and post neo-colonial and post-colonial pressures. But it's interesting too to think about like what's happening here and the way that like write about the fall of democracy and the rise of populism with Modi. There's something similar happening, right? And I mean, would you say, maybe you don't think that, but I was just wondering, like, the similarities between what's happening politically here now and
I wouldn't. No, I hesitate from that because I feel like these societies have achieved states of complexity, of prosperity, of a certain history. Like I feel like that one has to, like, as a betting man, I would like that to sort of the speed with which other places can come undone.
Mm.
I would not want to put my money on. And I think that what's interesting here, which is cultural almost rather than political, is that that Sartre thing, like in Black Orpheus, where he says, like, the white man has had the privilege of seeing without being seen for 3,000 years. And now, like, the gaze come back to us and we feel encircled by the gaze of others. I think that is happening, and the kind of anger that can come from that, which of course only Black, brown, and yellow people felt for so long. Always feeling misrepresented, I mean, that now exists and is part of our political discourse, which is, again, an interesting thing, because it's quite an difficult intellectual idea that we're talking about,
Right.
that is, like, broadly out in the open, like at the podiums of, like, the White House. And, it's so I think that the cultural stuff is very, very interesting. Traffic moving the other direction. Not just one gaze and one sense of power, but like that movement the other way.
Right, like even the shifting global order and global powers, yeah. I mean, to just kind of like hover on this point, you wrote, I became Pakistani the day I wrote a story for the cover of Time magazine entitled India's Divider in Chief. Nothing, not my Indian upbringing, not my contribution to Indian letters, not my aging mother and grandmother could save me. Like that assignment of you suddenly being Pakistani, did that force you to kind of have to realign any parts of yourself? Or was it just...
I mean, firstly, you have to see that this word has always been used in India as a shorthand for all Muslims. For it's the easiest way to make India's 200 million Muslim suspects is to call them a Pakistani, and I like. I mean, it's just the circumstances of my life were so strange that they were not wrong. I mean, that I was, and I was never walking away from that. I was walking towards that and had sought to get to know my Pakistani family and my Pakistani identity. But it's just it's like the kind of thing you can't explain when you have a gun to your head. It's like you need a book. But if somebody kind of says to you, like, what, you're like sort of rambling into a footnote, and they're like, your father's Pakistani, you're Pakistani, get out. That's the kind of, so I think there's that kind of feeling of 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 a very narrow, very brutal sort of way of looking that which wishes to kind of make something of you and will probably succeed. And the writer, with all his complexities, kind of scrambling behind the tide of his trying to, make it up. So yeah, it's just that it's an asymmetrical conversation, is I think what I'm trying to say.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about partition politics. I don't want to assume that everybody in the room knows like that history and how it led to one of the most devastating migration crises of modern history. Like 15 million people were displaced, 1 million people died. If you could maybe just talk about how British divide and rule policies mobilize religious identity into a political weapon, and like how you both sort of speak to the aftershocks of this violence, and how you see it still playing out in the way that you pick it up in your work as well. Like your personal sort of relationship to that historical moment.
Well, I think in both of us have a kind of deep relationship to it. My family was living in Lahore when partition happened. They moved, but also my great grandfather was involved in the boundary commission that drew the. He was a judge, and he was it was basically decided by Cyril Radcliffe, a British guy who came essentially for a few weeks to divide India, and they thought that better to have someone who doesn't know anything about India do it, which is a hilarious thing in retrospect. And they kind of had these 3 or 4 judges, a token Muslim, a token Hindu, a token Sikh, who didn't really have much power or say. So, partition is a sort of big part of my background. But, the interesting thing about it is that, of course, like it's a trauma that people aren't able to talk about. People don't in Delhi, which is an entire city formed by refugees of partition, mostly Punjabis. People don't really talk about the kind of traumas they suffered. For someone like me, what was formative was the riots in 2002. It's really a pogrom that happened where the chief minister of the state of Gujarat at the time, who is now the prime minister of India, Modi, essentially oversaw the massacre of 3,000 Muslims. In a very sort of, the state machinery had been mobilized to do this. And I was just a freshman in college. And I do think that that was somehow a defining event, because that was the first time. There have been riots. There have always been riots and sort of communal violence in India, but maybe it was the first time it had been televisually captured in a way. Like, this is true of even 9/11 and terrorism, is that those things always existed as well, but they didn't have the kind of reach that they have thanks to television and multiple news channels. And so definitely, like, that moment and then the slow rise of Modi has inflected everything I've written. Like, it's sort of impossible not to, I find it impossible not to write about it. And partly because I come from milieu, which is like, the trader caste of Hindus, where many people are Modi supporters. So for me, interrogating that is really important. Like, and there's a lot of unreconstructed hatred of Muslims.
Yeah.
So what is the source of that? Especially since most people haven't actually even interacted with Muslims. It's like a segregated city, right? So that became important, and that obviously, as Aatish was saying, those things are echoes of partition, because the continued demonization of Muslims is sort of like a leftover of like divide and rule of different kinds.
I mean, and also, like, I at least, I have a lot of difficulty with this idea of historical agency, of historical, like, a sense of not merely being acted upon, oh, the British came, we were just such a great mixed society. They imposed these restrictions, and look at us, we killed each other like in bloody slaughter. My grandfather was very much devoted to the idea with Iqbal of founding Pakistan and of this vision of this Muslim purity and of this state. And the idea that all these people filled with like brutal passions was just simply like, that this grand puppeteer, the English, sitting in, like, it for me, it's just a very difficult. And now when you see poor England with just an Indian prime minister the other day, like, you just think the whole thing kind of like, it feels false. Like, there's a moment where you have to talk about your own capacity for hatred, for like division, for like even this colonial moment, which had such a bloom everywhere in society after society, has revealed itself to contain seeds of ethno-nationalism, to contain seeds of majoritarianism, whether it's in Algeria, whether it's in India. And so for me, at least, like, it's like, it feels very like intellectually like a dead end to be like, yes, this was all done to us.
Right. But the force and the power that it can exert on tensions that exist on the ground can't be underestimated either. Right?
No.
Like the fact that they moved the planning of partition up by a year and did it in 5 weeks and just drew ad hoc borders, and people were going this way and that way, right? Not exactly
people thought
knowing.
at first there would be soft borders. They thought they could come back. I mean, that kind of exile. Yeah.
Yeah, people didn't really know like where the Muslim safe havens were going to be, or right, like that kind of chaos.
It does always make me laugh that when I was in Iran, all over the Muslim world, America is the big Satan, and
Yes.
Britain is the little Satan.
Yes.
But the Iranians, sophisticated people, refuse to believe that someone as bumbling as the Americans could be the big Satan. So only in Iran is Britain the big Satan, and America is the little Satan.
Well, I mean, they did own like 85% of our oil for many, many years. So yeah, I think it's interesting because this is like an ongoing debate. I feel like even in Iran, like, is it us or is it them? Did they do this to us, or are we like this? Right? Like, it's a huge. You're constantly, and I'm not sure that the question really has like a clear, for me at least, a very clear answer, because it's so complicated, and it's impossible to go back and think what would things have been like
Right.
had they not arrived, had they not been there, right? It's just, yeah, like we can only know what we know.
Right.
And when I think of that, I was going to say, like, when we were talking earlier, I was thinking the big problem of the time is like how to be whole without resorting to fictions, even though, of course, we're fiction writers, is like this thing of what it did in some, because, you know, I think Aatish and I have also spoken about this, which is that for me, when I'm writing, British rule is irrelevant. Like, I don't think about it.
Right.
Like, it's been enough time that it's not like it never figures in my writing. It's not a problem. And I also think that, you know, with historical hindsight, yes, it was a terrible thing, but also it led to, you know, India would not have been a unified territory in this particular way. It would, you know, there wouldn't have been certain infrastructure that we got. There were certain things that came, but the thing that it did that was terrible was what it did to the psyche of the colonized people, right? Which is that, like, it creates a rupture where you don't feel whole because your identity has been kind of taken from you. And then to feel whole, you have to invent a fast, right? You have to invent, like, we were a unified Hindu nation. It was always a Hindu country. The Muslims came from outside, you know, and so, like, I try to think about this even with my particular position as someone who's, like, obviously very privileged living here, gets to write about India as well. It's like, how do I not fall into that trap where I clearly have a need to be whole? Writing fulfills that. But how do I do that without coming up with an idea of India that is, like, romanticized or is false? And that, of course, is playing out in sort of in every country right now in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's what I meant with my earlier question of there is this general rise of suspicion around pluralism, right? That we're seeing, like, here, and I see it in Italy, like in Iran, and Modi's India, right? Like this, it's just very overt. You know, there's like all these moments in history where it peaks and it's like undeniable that structures are being shaped around this vision. And we're in one of those peaks, right? In America. Like there's a deep suspicion of pluralism, right?
Well, I think also one should not one should not minimize the intellectual danger posed by like post-Enlightenment Europe to Europe itself. I mean, the ability of modernity to destroy traditional Europe happened in Europe first. And so, like, that kind of mechanism by which an idea, a way of life, a new kind of living, a new place for the individual, a new place for science, that spread of that thing, even in the society that invented it, was a violent experience. Can you imagine how much more it is to traditional societies where, when it arrives in the form that it does, it completely paralyzes tradition?
Yeah.
And so tradition no longer can grow. A line is drawn.
Right.
You know, and at the same time, as you were pointing out, every way forward doesn't feel like a way forward. You know, every way forward feels like almost a sense of fear that that line has been drawn, that a moment of rupture has occurred, and what now? And of course, many non-colonized countries, including Japan, including Thailand, have felt all of that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I love there's an essay in the collection about southern Spain, and you know, like Al-Andalus, and, you know, thinking about the way that, like, a lot of the tools that were then later used and, like, exported elsewhere in, like, the colonies were first applied, right? To, like, erase and cleanse, like, the Sephardic people in Al-Andalus, the Muslims. And also there was, like, a fragile coexistence that can be either romanticized or, like, you know, dismantled, like, depending on where a critic stands on those things. But yeah, I think it's totally true that, like, the damage done, you know, to Europe also of, like, cleansing itself of, like, the idea of Islam, cleansing itself of, like, the Jewish presence. Like, we're still living in the aftermath and in the consequences of that. We're still seeing it play out in Palestine, right? It's really hard. I think we, like, live in a world where we're so blinded by the idea of the nation state, like this country, this country, this country, when in reality, there's so much cross contamination, right? That, like, that's the part that makes it impossible for me to think about to move forward, because once you see the complexities, right, it's really hard to know, well, what now? You know, like, where should Iran go next? Like, it, I don't know. Like, do you think, like, where would you like India to go next? Like, is that some exercise that you do in your imagination? Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think all these countries the foolishness is like they all panic when it's too late. Like even the US, like it's like you look around this room, it's like a multicultural
Yeah.
room, and that it's like already happened.
Yeah.
Now we're panicking.
Yeah.
Like that's the kind of weird thing. And same with India, it's like deeply modern. Now we're panicking. So if
Mhm.
there was a way to kind of just, I mean, this would be ideal. It doesn't happen. A way to live with the contradictions and to recognize that like that's just the way societies grow. That's great. I just don't know if there's a, a politician who exists who has like who has articulated that or is able to do it without, because the part of the problem I especially see here is that this is actually like a very puritanical society where like politics always, like we're in a terrible moment, but it always has a feeling of like this is the worst moment ever because both sides are evil or good.
Mhm.
Right. And same with like multiculturalism then gets elevated to like a religious principle on the left.
Mhm.
And there's the way of talking about it that would be, not in that tone would be great. And I don't know, but I don't know what, I'm not a politician. I don't know the answer. It's just that I feel like in fiction, I try to write about all this stuff as soberly as possible. Like I'm careful not to celebrate anything. Like
Yeah.
I want it to look like it looks, but not to be hysterical about it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the only way to steady your nerves, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I'm just still thinking about, like, yeah, that you don't think actively about British rule, but at the same time, a lot of like what's happening, right? Is
Well, and
still in
the
like,
fact that we speak English.
yeah. So
I
that
mean,
was
I
going
mean,
to
I
be
think like
my,
that's a big
yeah.
part of it.
The next
Yeah.
question is that like this idea of like, you, the danger of, yes, okay, you get the infrastructure, whatever, but then there's the danger of feeling subaltern, the danger of feeling like some part of your dignity has been injured as like a person. You're not whole anymore, right? And I think language is a very important tool that gets used in that way. So I wanted to talk, since we're writers, about like what does it feel like for you to write in English? And I know you both love the English language, and you're both such amazing sentence writers. Like there's obviously like love there, but do you also have other feelings? And how would you define, like, do you think of yourself as a global Anglophone writer? Or like how do you think about it?
I mean, like, it's funny because you get to a point where it's so difficult to re-enter certain moments of wringing one's wrists. But obviously, I wrote a book called The Way Things Were, which is where Sanskrit is its own character and etymology
An excellent book. By the way.
is so important. And through that feeling of Sanskrit as this first utterance of this shared Proto-Indo-European past, I couldn't deny that there was this feeling of like, well, here is this family of languages, and this glorious language was one of the first expressions of it. But what was really going on in my head was this feeling, probably of a shame, of a marginality, of an uncertainty, of a worry about authenticity, all related to English. And so suddenly to think of Sanskrit as the sister of Greece and of Greek and of Latin and it suddenly in my head remade my relationship to language. And I thought, oh, well, that's a nice way to think of it, of these layers or whatever. But again, of course, it is partially an artificial construction, and what one was feeling for so long was that really, like, I would say, really a fear of not being understood.
Mhm.
Do you know, like of writing in a language that felt in India sometimes almost ornamental or decorative. Like there's certain movies like English for English
Mhm.
where people say things like that, like, "Oh, he's just talking English," like it completely like word and meaning having parted ways of this language being a kind of expression only of power and belonging and things. And I who care very much for words having meaning,
Mhm.
felt like I couldn't operate in that space. But then, I don't. I don't suffer from the pain of it anymore. I feel one should be quite stern with this tendency to kind of slip into a sentimentality about, and I, even when Indians or Pakistanis, when they talk in Urdu and English, they sometimes say things that feel so amazingly authentic, but they're utterly banal. They'll give you some expression, oh, like it goes like whatever, and it's this feeling of like, oh my God, I'm expressing like that. You now understand the true spirit of it, and you think, if it's that smart, you should be able to translate it. Shouldn't just be something that like just touches the chord. So I don't know. Yeah. Less patience with it now, probably.
And I have like view I have is that like we people like Aatish and I like unconsciously like live in an empire of English, which is that like the reason I'm here, like I think about why am I here is like because I was able to move from one English speaking milieu to another.
Right.
I could I could do well here better than like an immigrant who doesn't speak English, because that's a privilege, and like I can communicate with people. And that has created like certain links that like we're not completely conscious of. Like I'm exiled physically, but maybe I'm not that exiled when it comes to language, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And the other is that like English does have like, it's like totally a class in India. If you speak English, you have you're read as being someone who's educated in a particular way, as being middle or upper middle class if you speak like very fluent English. And so that class of people essentially took over from the colonizers. And I think, they feel deeply inauthentic because they're deeply disconnected from the mass of India, which doesn't speak English, which speaks regional languages. And that's where this idea of like, when you read reviews by Indian critics or by South Asian critics, they're obsessed with authenticity because they themselves feel inauthentic.
Right.
And I think like over time, I think two things are happening. One is that English has become Indianized to a large degree. But on the other hand, there is like with the BJP an attempt to like bring back Hindi and to make it the lingua franca of the country. And I don't know where I stand on that exactly. I will say that like for me, I there must be a kind of depression that comes with like not I obviously speak Hindi, but I can't really write in it. And there are some times where I realize when I'm switching back to Hindi that like there's an emotional register that's missing for me over here, that when I'm back in India comes back. So yeah, it's very complex. The idea, hopefully I could just keep like toggling between them in my brain, but it's not always possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for those incredible answers. I think we can turn to the audience for questions. I have so many more questions about the work specifically, but I want to make sure. Yes, Tam.
The Irish writer Michael Hartnett in a long poem called A Farewell to English said English was the perfect language to sell pigs in. And I think that really focuses on, I suppose, the commerciality and the fact that English, a Nigerian writer says, language is the loot that we get in war. And in a sense, for people who have been colonized by the British, the language is the loot that we get to keep. And I wondered what you thought of those two images. The perfect language to sell pigs in and the loot that we carry with us.
Yeah. Firstly, every time when we hit where we are like indulging ourselves about India, but every time I encounter an Irishman or someone that, like, I always get this feeling of like well, we speak English. Well, we had the English for 300 years. He's like, try 800. And so like, it is, of course, these things happen so much nearer to home. But yeah, I certainly, and Joyce for me feels like somebody who had all these Indian questions, or would feel like Indian questions, Indian anxieties, and that like, that sense of, people casting nets at him, and him of him trying to fly free of those nets, and claiming English in that way. That feels very close to me. That sense of the loot, or the and so yeah, I think that this, of course, it comes up with Fanon and the French and MSS are all the same issues. Like, and with the English, at least, there was never the same illusion that you could be English by speaking English the way like the French kind of advanced this idea that, there was Francophonie. There was never really in the same sense that English. I mean, it was much looser and one lived with senses of unbelonging. But I very much jealously guard that loot. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would agree with Aatish, and I think that like the we are talking about self-consciousness about English, but I'm not sure that like a generation that's 10 years younger than us in India would necessarily have these anxieties of self-consciousness. Right. Like it might just be another Indian language to them that is useful and that they are proficient in.
Yeah.
So I just think like that tale of colonialism is going further and further away.
Yeah, even with this book for the first time, and my Hindi and Urdu is not bad, but it's like it's a learnt language. It was not, or a relearned language, and I was suddenly in a position of doing interviews in Hindi and Urdu, which was the first time in 15 years of writing or publishing in India that suddenly like the balance had tilted.
And you could switch back and forth. People were reading the book in English but interviewing you.
Right, you're almost obliged to.
Yeah.
And so like very nice states of bilingualism, which is again, it's not all loss.
I like to say, just on this point, Karan, that Dubliners is the best book about Islamabad ever written. Because there's a deep post-colonial, like city falling apart kind of vibe to it that rings true. But I was gonna ask a question that is maybe an annoying question, but it's a form question, and I get this sense often when we're talking about post-colonial, now global Anglophone writers, that people are quite concerned with the politics. And the politics are real and we're all inhabiting them. But there also seems to be a way that both of you treat the craft of writing quite particularly and in unique ways. So is there a sense that you have about your creative practice either in the context of, say, Indian fiction or in the context of contemporary, what we call global Anglophone writing today? Like, is there an aesthetic that you think you align with? No, I guess I would get there.
You want to go first?
No.
Actually, it's a really good question because I think I thought about it more when I started writing. Like when I wrote my first novel, Family. I mean, I was quite young. I was in my early 20s, and I had a very distinct sense of like, okay, I don't want to write like the big political Indian novel. It's going to be like it's going to be hyper local in Delhi in these neighborhoods. And they're going to talk exactly like people talk in Delhi, which is like without translating Hindi words. And the language itself is going to use a lot of references that are local, and it's going to be comic and stuff. And that actually, I think, turned out to be a thing that many people were thinking at the time. I think in a weird way, The God of Small Things inaugurated that, because even though that feels like a very vast novel, it's actually just about the tiniest of tiny communities. And it's not like set, like it's not like A Suitable Boy, which is this 1,400-page amazing novel, by the way, but like exhausted almost the possibilities of that set all over India.
Yeah.
And so then afterwards, I think it became, it's weird because I am much more concerned with getting the kind of tone of experience. Like I think with the Association of Small Bombs, I couldn't write it till I actually started to think in Hindi and then translate out of it. Like it was this weird thing where it was a book that was very sort of death saturated, and it was very easy to become like morose or to fall into that. And then at some point I was like, I can't write this, but like I had this like image of my grandmother and how she would say, वो train station gaya tha, wo khatam ho gaya, which means like he went to the train station and he was finished.
Yeah.
But the way of saying finished for someone dying was so unsentimental.
Terminated, yeah.
And so this like Punjabi existentialism kind of helped me write that. And I feel like that's the thing that I'm operating within. I don't like, because this time I really felt like I was not at all aware of, weirdly, of being in an aesthetic
category. It was just like, this is how I write now.
It's really interesting though, like the idea, like this is something that I often feel while I'm writing is that it's maybe the only moment where all these parts aren't in conflict because I
Yes,
can be
exactly.
feeling,
Right.
Right.
like I
That's why
can
we
be
write.
feeling in
Yeah.
Farsi and I don't know, thinking in Spanish, but writing in English. And
Exactly.
Yeah.
yeah, and somehow it gives you this,
You
like,
feel
it's
whole.
like you feel
feel
whole,
whole.
like it's
Yeah.
all converging. And a reader may or may not be able to access that depending. And it doesn't really matter, right? It's like, that's the process. And,
Yeah.
and it's like it feels very empowering that you can lay claim to all these things.
Yeah.
And nobody else is adjudicating over your sense of belonging or
Yeah.
unbelonging,
Yeah.
right? Except you and the page. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I will quickly, sorry, Aatish, just one quick thing I forgot to say is that there is probably an unconscious aesthetic, which is that I'm not, realism, right? It's like something, maybe I'm not even aware if I'm doing it because that's a dominant marketplace here, right? I just can't say. But were I living in a society where everything was magic realist, maybe I'd be writing that. That's always a weird thing where you can't really say. Sorry.
No, I feel like in a weird way, the traveling self is another locus of like incredible wholeness, because like you never feel more yourself when you're away from home. And like I was in the end of a conversation in Nepal where there was a Tibetan monk who'd come down to talk to me about Buddhism, but his friend had grown up in Dehradun, and there was this three-way conversation between like Hindi, English, Nepali, Tibetan, and I thought, like, this is great. This is like, like here are all the sides of yourself engaged and at work, and like you're in the world, and this is part of the richness of all of that, of all of those breakages. It's not, it hasn't just stripped the cupboard bare, but you're like able to kind of find a sort of like a kind of a new hybridity of a sort.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, and I love that energy in all your travel essays. I mean, and also I was telling Aatish earlier, like he's traveling through the space, but I feel like what you're actually doing is like a work of the archaeologist or the
Yes.
work of the
Yeah,
excavator,
totally.
because it's like, that you keep peeling back layers and layers of history and civilizations and encounters, and it's like you're going deeper while you're also, it's like vertical and horizontal in the way that you're working. And to me it has the sensibility of like the pilgrim, like the Islamic pilgrim
Right.
thinker who like walks, right? And the act of walking through a space is revelation itself. And the act of being like estranged from yourself is also revelation. And I just, it's something I really appreciate. I had all these
Yeah,
questions
it's rare
about
to
the
get
work
to
actually.
get it like
yeah.
to have travel writing that has such depth, because often it can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And it's not like touristy commercial. There's nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're beautiful, Aatish, yeah. Anyway, I'll just read this one tweet from Modi because I thought it was strange and incredible. You know what is my crime for them? That a person born to a poor family is challenging their sultanate. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, them being like the English speaking like elite who are like obsessed with questions of authenticity and the
Also,
sultanate.
yeah, it's so clever to use that word
Sultanate, yeah.
sultanate.
So yeah, of course, it's
So
like
it's like he's
invoking
making
Muslim
a
rule.
1,000 years of foreign rule. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
of the Moguls. Yeah. So, he knows how to play with words. So any other questions?
He's also a poet, the worst poet ever.
the worst.
There's someone
Twitter.
behind that. No, you had
Bad
a
artists,
question? No?
bad artists make
I was
great
gonna say,
dictators.
yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
Napoleon,
Hitler.
failed writer.
Saddam Hussein, lots of novels.
Hitler,
Yeah.
Hitler failed.
Failed theme.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Aatish, you were talking about like earlier today we were talking about travel writing and like doing it in this kind of deep archaeological sense that you're using. I think it's really helpful. And you said just a moment ago, there is no like truer self than the traveling self, or something to that tenor. I was wondering what particular affordances that the perspective of your excellent book allowed you to see about yourself, and then also what limitations you felt while writing with the lack of a deep kind of communal engagement
Right.
with the place. So what were some of the affordances of the style and kind of context of the writing, and what were some of the limitations as you were writing that you felt?
I think in this particular, what was very nice was, after years of like stewing over India in America and harassing Karan Mahajan here with these concerns, like India was gone and the US had not opened necessarily to me as a place that to write about. And I was kind of like sent out into the world. And I realized that a lot of the concerns that I had would not necessarily be the concerns of a European or American traveler, that in some ways that my anxieties about history, about layers of about these little nodal points of history that don't go quiet in a society, that resonate over the centuries, that kind of trouble the sleep of a place, all of these things that like they were really, they were points of entry and empathy, and they allowed me to kind of like dramatize or to sort of express what people felt in very intimate ways about what was going on in their societies, not political ways, but the deeper ways in which culture expresses itself as politics. And as for the limitations, I'm always very clear about the limitation. One is the outsider. One is one is dependent on accident, on the invitation or the graciousness of people, their desire to talk, translators, language. All of these things are very real. I think as long as one doesn't assume or that one is not limited, that kind of travel is very rich. It's rich when Koch does it in Egypt. It's rich when Naipaul does it in different societies. It's rich also because it's not meant to be. And I think sometimes in the US, it exists less as a genre, but in England, where I think it's probably more solidified as a genre, like it's not meant to be it's meant to be something that's imperfect.
Mm.
It's an attempt or like an essay or venturing out into a society, and I think the more you're able to see around your limitations, the more the reader might feel that they're in safe hands.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to both of you.